Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Today we will continue with the fourth chapter, page 62, of White Fragility. White racial innocence. Because we're not raised to see ourselves in racial terms, or to see white space as racialized space, we position ourselves as innocent of race. On countless occasions, I have heard white people claim that because they grew up in segregation, they were sheltered from race. At the same time, we turn to people of color, who may also have been grown up in a racially segregated space because of the decades of de jure and de facto policies that blocked them from moving into white neighborhoods, to learn about racism. But why aren't people of color who grew up in segregation also innocent of race? I ask my readers to reflect deeply on the idea that white segregation is racially innocent. I don't think any form of racial segregation is innocent of racism, which is the reason why we, as a society, made segregation illegal. The idea of creating that line is an illegal position because we recognize the racism in that. And again, there was a time racism was systematic in law in our society. And the effects of that are still felt till today. There's nobody that can make an argument that that's not true. The question is, what does that mean in terms of going forward, and how do you make corrections? And there's nothing in this book that it just wants to make people feel guilty for their past. And not their personal past, but historical past, which is very irrational. Imagine for a minute you had a father that committed murder. As you, as being the child of that murderer, should you walk around with the guilt of your father's murder? Should the sins of the father be put upon the children? I personally think that's an immoral position. Because people of color are not seen as racially innocent, they're expected to speak to issues of race, but must do so on white terms. I don't know what she means about this yet, and hopefully she'll explain. This idea that racism is not a white problem enables us to sit back and let people of color take real risks of invalidation and retaliation as they share their experiences. I don't think people who explain their experiences with race get retaliation against them. At least not where I'm from. Maybe there are parts of society where that does happen. And if they were, let's talk about that. But I have no idea what she's talking about when somebody says, I was just discriminated against. I just had a racial incident. I don't think I've ever said, wow, I don't believe you. Or, you must be making that up. But we are not required to take similar cross-racial risks. They, not we, have race. Thus, they are holders of racial knowledge. In this way, we position ourselves as standing outside hierarchical social relations. White flight may be seen as another aspect of white racial innocence, as often justified by a belief that people of color, again especially black people, are more prone to crime, and that if too many black people move into a neighborhood, crime will increase, home values will go down, and neighborhoods will deteriorate. The nature, if you take a look at the stats of crime, just factually, African Americans have a much higher crime rate than any other group. That's a statement of fact. When African Americans make it and they make money, they move out of their neighborhood. Why? The nature of almost a denial that there is crime in black neighborhoods is very sad. Now, should there be? No. And by the way, middle-class black people don't have this issue. And there are upper-class, middle-class African-American neighborhoods where they don't have these types of issues and home prices don't drop like that. But when crime comes to a neighborhood, it does. When I was growing up, there was a place where there was this amusement park. And it was very, very popular, especially during the summer. And Mayor Lindsay decided that he was going to take the projects that were in the Bronx, and there were fires that took place, and he was going to bring them out to the area near this amusement park. I think within 3 years, and there was a couple of shootings and violence and people stopped coming, the amusement park and that entire area took a huge dive. It's what happened. It's not because people ran. It wasn't because of racism. It wasn't because people were saying that. It's a matter of safety. There's a movie theater. It made national news near where I live, where people were going and enjoying the movies. And I think it was The Godfather 3, if I remember the correct movie. The Godfather 3 with Al Pacino. And there was a shooting in the movie theater. That movie theater is also out of business. Now that took a lot of years later to do, but they started putting up first then the metal detectors, and they started to try to make it a safety in that way. But the nature is that who wants to go to the movies with the fear of somebody being shot? So this idea that we're just going to pretend that crime has nothing to do with it. A lot of times I say to the clientele who I worked with, I said, if African Americans as a population as that could be identified stop doing crime for a 2-year period, the perception would change dramatically. It was very interesting because when with the issue that happened on 9/11, it was very funny that the airports and the security originally, before they started taking away grandmothers and old, to be racially diverse, they take everybody now. But originally they started to profile what a terrorist might be. And there were a lot of comedians at the time, and I remember them saying, finally, it's not us. Because there was nobody looking towards a person of color as being the reason that are going to blow up an airplane or are going to hijack one. They didn't have that thought process. That was an issue. Now, had people of color been doing that, it would have changed the perception. Now, is perception always correct? No. But there are perceptions that take place based upon reality that is basically just totally dismissed. Like, yeah, there's never an issue with black crime because that doesn't exist. But the stats and reality don't say that. Now, why is that the case? That's a whole separate issue. But the nature of it, to say that crime isn't a factor, is just factually wrong. For example, in a study of race and perceptions of crime conducted by sociologists Heather Johnson and Thomas Shapiro, white families consistently discussed fear of crime and associated crime with people of color. In their minds, the more people of color in an area, specifically blacks and Latinos, the more dangerous the area was perceived to be. Researchers matching census data and police department crime statistics show this association does not hold, but these statistics do not quell white fears. I would love to know what such statistics were that. And again, was it a matter of the middle-class black neighborhoods? Because that's not what people generally talk about when they talk about those neighborhoods. Because generally black and Latino neighborhoods are not particularly high economically in terms of where they live. And I'm wondering if it was the middle-class neighborhoods that they were looking at. I think the national average, 40% of all murders is committed by African Americans, yet males, and yet they make up 6% of the population, way overrepresented. So I know that fact to be true. So I wonder what she's talking about, because she doesn't hold where these statistics even come from. For most whites, the percentage of young men of color in the neighborhood is directly correlated with the perception of neighborhood crime level. It's very interesting because my clients who are African American also believe that young African American males are more dangerous than African American females. Just shocking. In fact, one of the clients recently said, these young guys got to stop shooting people. Deeply white associations of black people with crime distort reality and the actual direction of danger that has historically existed between whites and blacks. The vast history of extensive and brutal explicit violence perpetrated by whites and the ideological rationalizations are trivialized through white claims of racial innocence. The power we now wield, and we have wielded for centuries, is thus obscured. It has been well documented that blacks and Latinos are stopped by police more often than whites and are for the same activities, and they receive harsher sentences than whites that do for the same crimes. Now, again, this is very interesting because the stats on this, specifically with stop and frisk, Again, she's talking about stop and frisk as a situation. Now, the way that Bloomberg did stop and frisk and the way that Giuliani did stop and frisk were very different. And with Giuliani, the stop and frisk rates that had resulted in higher arrest rate than the way that Bloomberg did it. It also represented that Bloomberg, it went up dramatically and got a much lower result, and therefore that's why they actually stopped the practice. But if you take a look at what's going on in New York now, and the crime rate and the murder rate, since they got rid of a couple of units, specifically the undercover units, the crime and the shootings have gone up dramatically, specifically in my areas where my clients live. And they tell me how horrible it is. It is the reason why 81% of African Americans in the latest Gallup poll want more police or the same number of police. Research has also shown the major reason for this racial disparity can be attributed to the belief that held by judges and others that the cause of the criminal behavior. For example, the criminal behavior of white juveniles is often seen as caused by external factors. The youth come from a single-parent home, is having a hard time right now, just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, or was bullied at school. Attributing the cause and the action to external lessens the person's responsibility and classifies the person as a victim. But black and Latino youth are not offered the same compassion. Now, in this way, I absolutely agree with this statement. This is why I have a difficulty with the idea of the judges' discretions. I'm not a fan of that. I think that judges have a bias, and their bias will come out. Even if it's in small degrees, it will have dramatic effects, and I think it does. I think that we look at people, and when Barack Obama said that Trayvon Martin reminded him of his son, or that would be his son, I think that clouds the way that you see something. I think that the sentence for a black person, a white person, Hispanic person, a man, a woman, should all be the same. But we know that's not true. Men get higher sentences than women. Because in a place of equality, we don't want to... I never heard women claim it's not fair about the inequality in sentences against women who get much leaner sentences and much less sentences than men would get. And then, yes, African American men get much higher sentences than whites on average. And it does have to do with this. That psychologically, what ends up happening is it's looked at as a symptom of a problem as opposed to the problem itself. The issue is the aspect of the judicial system should be blind. It shouldn't be that way. And this is the one place where we see the most systemic racism in the United States today, in that system. But in terms of the nature of the policing system, which of course is a huge controversy today, a lot of it has to do with that people don't understand how the system works. And again, it's very easy to get pulled into a narrative and be wrong. And again, I admit myself that I got pulled into certain narratives, thought a certain way, and then when I got certain facts, I had to change my mind. That's not a comfortable feeling. Don't like having to do that, especially when you're filled with a false narrative from the media that likes to sell its media that people watch, and as opposed to getting things right. There was just a case actually today where I thought was absolutely horrific. You saw a naked man with a hood over his head, and you're like, oh my God. And then he died from asphyxiation. And now the police are off the job. And I'm like, oh my God, this is horrific. Now, before I made a conclusion, I actually did some research. And then found out that this hood is part of their way to protect them. The guy said he had COVID, and this was designed to protect them from exposure. So this hood is not, these people are just going ahead and putting a hood on somebody. It's part of their police procedure. Now again, whether you agree, disagree, whether you think there should be different procedures, but the nature of what they were doing would be following the protocol that they were following. Now, does that mean they made other mistakes? Now, I don't know enough yet, and we'll see about the case and when we see the facts come out. But I no longer rush to judgment just because the media wants to put up another face. When black and Latino youth go before a judge, the cause of the crime is often attributed to something internal to the person. The youth is naturally more prone to crime, is more animalistic, has less capacity for remorse. Similarly, a 2016 study found that half of a sample of medical students and residents believe that blacks feel less pain. That's absolutely horrific if true, but again, don't know if that's the case or not. I don't believe that black people feel any less pain than white people. I don't think pain is an issue about race. On the same token, I believe that people are capable of anything. And the nature is that there are animalistic people everywhere. And we have also the ability to change that as well. I've come across them through my career. I've worked with a population who have done some horrific things. Whites continue to receive the benefit of the doubt not granted to people of color. Our race alone helps establish our innocence. No, I think that the poor system of our criminal system is what causes it. And I definitely think the judge's discretion, which is what they're trying to pass now in California, which only is going to create more disparity. See, it's very interesting how people make arguments for certain things, not realizing what the unintended consequence is going to be. For those of us who work to raise the racial consciousness of whites, simply getting whites to acknowledge that our race gives us an advantage is a major effort. Again, there are places that it's an advantage. There are places where it's a disadvantage. There are places that if you live as a white person and you grow up in a different neighborhood, it's a huge disadvantage. So in certain circumstance, because circumstance plays a role in this as well. Certain times there'll be an advantage, certain times there'll be a disadvantage. The defensiveness, denial, and resistances are deep, but acknowledging advantage is only a first step. To this acknowledgement can be used in a way that renders it meaningless and allows us white people to exempt ourselves from further responsibility. I don't think that any person is responsible for anybody else's behavior. I think that is immoral. If I said to you, you are responsible for your brother and you must stop him from doing this behavior and it's your job, that is immoral because you have no control. There's no locus of control. So the example of this is impossible. I mean, if it was up to me, I would stop any innocent person from ever being hurt by police. I don't want any white person or black person or any person to be hurt by police officers. On the same token, I've seen police abuse their power. As we all know, power corrupts. That's the nature of power. So anytime there's going to be a system of power, be it politicians, be it judges, there's going to be corruption. Always. But that doesn't change the fact that I wouldn't say the judge's wife is responsible for the judge's behavior or the judge's children. Each one of us are responsible for our own behavior as individuals, not as a group and a collective. I don't hold every African American responsible for every time an African American person murders somebody. You don't go, oh, look, you did it again. You're responsible. But this collective ideology of guilt is a problem, and it's wrong. For example, I often heard whites dismissively say, just because of the color of my skin, I have privilege. Statements like this describe privilege as it's a fluke, something that just happens to us as we move through life, with no involvement or complicity on our part. Now, what's interesting about this is she makes no case for why the person who gains the privilege has a role to play. Critical race scholar Zeus Leonardo critiques the concept of white privilege as something white people receive unwittingly. He says that this concept is analogous to suggesting that a person can walk through life with other people stuffing money into their pockets without any awareness or consent on the walker's part. That'd be very nice. The only problem is that when you don't know it. When you are being discriminated against many times, you don't know it. You could assume it, you could think it, but there's no way for you to actually know it. Too many times there's making assumptions without knowledge. And that's part of the problem here with the entire thought process. Leonardo challenges conceptualization with positions of white privilege as innocence by arguing that for white racial homogeny to saturate everyday life, it has to be secured by a process of domination or those acts, decisions, and policies that white subjects perpetuate on people of color. Viewing privilege as something that white people are just handed obscures the systematic dimensions of racism that must be actively and passively, consciously and unconsciously maintained. Or, the fact is that somebody else does something without your knowledge and you don't know. The expectation that people of color should teach white people about racism is another aspect of white racial innocence that reinforces several problematic racial assumptions. First, it implies that racism is something that happens to people of color and has nothing to do with us. No, actually, I believe that racism doesn't only happen to people of color. I believe you could be racist against white people. I believe somebody is racist against white people. You could be racist against Jews. You could be racist against Indians. You could be racist against Pakistanis. You could be racist against Muslims. You could be racist against many groups. I don't think it's only people of color. And it has to do with us that we consequently can't be expected to have any knowledge of it. I don't agree. I think we have a lot of knowledge of racism. This framework denies that racism is a relationship in which both groups are involved. Now that I would agree with. I don't think that a black person that gets lynched by Ku Klux Klan members, that the black person had a involvement in that racism. And I don't think that if a white person is attacked and he's beaten and he's called cracker and he's hurt because of that, or an NBA player says white boy, that somehow that's not racist. Because when you are identifying somebody by their skin color and you are identifying them and saying that as a delineating factor, that by definition is racism. By leaving it to people of color to tackle racial issues, we offload the tension of social dangers of speaking openly onto them. We can ignore the risk ourselves and remain silent on questions of our own culpability. I absolutely believe anytime there's an issue with racism around you, you should look for your culpability. And if you don't have any, you don't belong taking it. Second, this request requires nothing of us and reinforces unequal power relations by asking people of color to do our work. No, I don't think we're asking people of color to do our work. There are copious resources available on the subject generated by people of color who are willing to share the information. We haven't. We sought it out before this conversation. Why haven't we sought it out before this conversation? Well, for the people that don't live, like as she mentions earlier in the book, the people that don't live in neighborhoods where there are any racial differences, meaning everybody there is white and there are no black people, as she put into where she vacations in Idaho, in that lake, which I can't pronounce correctly. I don't think those people even thinking about race as an issue, because to them it's not an issue. But to us, specifically where I live, where there are multiracial people, race has always been an issue in discussion and conversation, how people see things. Third, the request ignores the historical dimensions of race relations. It disregards how often people of color have indeed tried to tell us what racism is like for them. In one of the places I work, we had a conversation, and it was very, very interesting because this was with the staff. And the staff, like as I mentioned before, is a lot of different races. And there's a number of different African Americans on staff. Their perception of the racism and things of that nature when discussion came up was very different. It wasn't monolithic. So when she says that people of color have this racial ideology, and they all believe this racial ideology, it's just not even factually true. There are black people that have different ideas about race. What race is like for them and how often they've been dismissed. To ask people of color to tell us how they experience racism without first building a trusting relationship and being willing to meet them halfway, but also us being vulnerable, shows us how we are not racially aware. And this exchange will probably be invalidating for them. I just want to tell you, in my career, there have been many times I've been dismissed. I've been dismissed by people of power who have not wanted to hear what I had to say and basically didn't care anything I had to say and basically dismissed everything I said. Now, if my skin color was black, now I could say it was racist. But my skin color is not black. So what can I say it is? Well, I can come up with a bunch of different reasons why. But the nature is to say that anybody is dismissed is only because of racism. Just factually, again, not true. It's a statement of, I feel this way, but to know its intent is a little bit more difficult. There was that case where the cops knocked over this old man who was 70-something years old, and his head hit the floor. It was horrible. And you saw this, it made the news. And he was a white person. And everybody said, horrible. But I said to one of my coworkers, I said, if that person would have been black that they did, what do you think people would be saying? Racism! It's all racism! Because you jump to the conclusion, well, he's got black skin, it's a white cop, must be racism. But no, the cop did it to a white person. And it was still horrible. But the nature of what they did is a horrible action. But it wasn't racism, because the person was white. And just because if the person is black does not necessitate that it has to be racism. But this is what everybody jumps to immediately. Segregated lives. On the television talk show in 1965, James Baldwin responded passionately to a Yale professor argument that Baldwin always concentrated on color. I don't know if white Christians hate, and again this is the Negroes, or not, but I know that we have a Christian church that is white, and a Christian church white is black, which is black. I know that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me, but I know that I'm not in their union. I don't know if there's real estate lobby is all against black people, but I know that the real estate lobby is keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith risking my life and have some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I've never seen. Now again, this was in 1965. Just basically, remember the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, a year later. So there's no question about that a lot of stuff of this was going on. But again, if you take a look at the 1930s, when it was even worse, African Americans were doing much better than they are even today. Life in the United States is deeply shaped by racial segregation of all racial groups. Whites are the most likely to choose segregation and are the group most likely to be in social and economic positions to do so. Growing up in segregations are schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, shopping districts, places of worship, entertainment, social gatherings, and elsewhere. Reinforces the message that our experiences and perspectives are the only ones that matter. We don't see people of color around us, and few, if any, adults acknowledge a lack of racial diversity as a problem. In fact, the classification of which neighborhoods are good and which are bad are always based upon race. Again, I don't agree with that statement either. They're based upon economics, not race. As I said, I don't think anybody's worried about, it's very interesting, I just had a coworker tell me that one of the football players just moved onto his block. Now, he's predominantly in a white neighborhood, this coworker, and the person that moved in was African American. And everybody's sitting there going, hey, come on over, what do you call it? Now, truth of the matter is, he's a football player. So, a lot of notoriety, something that is seen as an amazing thing, as wow, and, people like that celebrity. I don't think, when O.J. Simpson was very, very popular in his neighborhood, before everything that took place, and in terms of the horrible situation, but very popular. Okay, people weren't discriminating against him and didn't hate him because of the color of his skin. In fact, classification which neighborhoods are good or bad is always based upon race. Again, I disagree. These assessments may also be based on economic division among whites. These not only economic division among whites, but blacks as well. The economics make a much bigger issue here than race when it comes to this specific issue. Now, again, I'm talking about now in 2020, not in 1965. Because in 1965, it would be based upon the color of his skin. In 2020, it's not. And that's the aspect of this book that doesn't look at any change. It goes 1965, today, and believes it's the same thing. But if black and Latino students, Latinx as she puts it, attend a school in significant numbers, significant in the white mind, whites will perceive the school as bad. If they are people of color around us, we are seldom encouraged to build cross-racial friendships. And again, I can't deny that schools generally, low economics, in places with poor, like I said, low economics areas, normally do poorly in that are perceived poorly. Except the Kips Bay group, the Kips Bay school. That is in Harlem, and 90% of the kids that go to that school go to college, and their reputation is stellar. And that is with people of economic low income class. And it was done by somebody who went ahead and said, I have a different way of teaching, and shown that it actually works. Segregation is often lessened somewhat for poor urban whites who may live near and have friendships with people of color on the local level, because white poverty brings white people into the proximity with people of color in a way that suburban and middle-class life does not. Now let me ask you this question. Are those white people who came in to those relationships with people of color then also suffering from white privilege and systematic racism and hate the black people that they've become friends with? Except during gentrification, when the mixing is temporary, urban whites from the lower class may have more integrated lives on the micro level, but will still receive the message that achievement means moving away from the neighborhood and schools that illuminate our poverty. And yes, because those neighborhoods are generally unsafe for the white people who are living next to people who are white people who are committing crime too. Upward mobility is the great class goal in the United States, and social environment gets tangibly whiter the higher ups you climb. Well, that has been changing also. The greatest growth in middle class today is in the African American community. Whiter environments in turn are seen as the most desirable. From upward mobile whites from the lower classes, reaching towards the most valuable place in society usually means leaving friends and neighborhoods of color behind. For example, I grew up in urban and poor and lived in an apartment building in a crowded rental-based neighborhood. In my childhood, there were many people of color around me, but I knew that if I wanted to improve my life, I would not stay in this neighborhood. Upward mobility would take me to whiter spaces. No, it would take you to places that have people that had more money. And if more people of color then gain more money, they'll be living in those spaces too. And that's what happens. It's economic, not race. And people of color that make money get out too. Why? Are they racist? But I knew that if I was improving my life, and I would stay in these neighborhoods and upward mobility take the space, and it has. I did not maintain those early relationships with people of color, and no one guided me to encourage me to do so. Segregation was still operating my life in the wider societal level. It was dictated what I learned in school, read in books, saw on TV, learned to value if I wanted to improve my life. Meritocracy. Just share this. When I was growing up, I moved in the summer time when I was away. I came back home and it was a new place. And all my friends and everybody that I knew from the area that I lived, I didn't have anymore. Because I was a kid and there wasn't really a way to connect, I lost all those friendships. And I had to start anew. It was traumatic. It was difficult to do. But it was something that I had to do. That does not mean that happened because of a systematic aspect of I finally got away from those people. That's not what goes on. And again, it's like talked about in a way that just, again, nothing to do with life. Meritocracy is a precious ideology in the United States, but neighborhoods and schools are demonstrably not equal. They are separate and unequal, and I agree, which is the reason why I'm a very big advocate for school choice. I think that it would help every single child to be in a school that doesn't fail them. I think the nature of the teachers' unions, and again, this goes back to the documentary Waiting for Superman. If you've never seen it, I suggest you do. You can take it out. It's great. It's well done. And it explains what's going on in our school systems and why there's a problem. But the nature of that is not racial. Tax bases, school resources, curriculum, textbook, opportunities from extracurricular activities, and the quality of the teaching staff differ widely between school districts. 100% true. Who is not aware that schools in the United States are vastly unequal? Without white people's interest or efforts invested in changing the system that serves the expense of others, advantage is passed down from generation to generation. There's a big lie that's right here. It's saying that white people did this. If you go to Baltimore, and Baltimore is run by African American mayor, literally, African Americans are, I think, ahead of almost everything in Baltimore. The police department, the heads of everything in Baltimore is African American. I think it has been for close to 40 years. And yet, they've done nothing to fix any of these problems. Why? Because they're invested in the unions. Has nothing to do with race, but it does have to do with economics and voting. And the way that the unions vote, and they're basically a slave to the union. So they're not looking out for the best interest of the child, they're looking out for the teachers' unions. And because of that, the children suffer. But that's not an issue of race. Rather than change these conditions so the public education is equal for all, we allow other people's children to do conditions that would be unacceptable for our own. And I here 100% agree that that should not be the case. And I'm wondering if Ms. DiAngelo would be for school vouchers and giving every child a choice to go to schools, so it would destroy the schools that fail our kids, and then these kids can go to schools that won't fail them. In 2009 study published in the American Journal of Education found that white suburban parents, who are mostly white, say they are selecting schools on the basis of test scores, that racial makeup of schools actually play a larger role in their school decision. Amy Stewart Wells, a professor of sociology and education at Columbia University Teachers College, found the same coded language when they studied how white parents choose their schools in New York City. She writes, in a post-racial era, we don't have to say it's about race or color of the kids in the building. We can concentrate poverty. We can concentrate poverty and kids of color and then fail to provide the resources, support, and sustain those schools. And then we could see a school full of black kids and say, oh, look at their test scores. It's very tidy now, this whole system. No, we can look at their test scores because we can look at the test scores and the problems of what's going on. It's not only about the idea that the schools are failing them. Because if you look historically after slavery, during slavery, it was illegal to teach black people to actually read. There were black people that learned to read. There were black people that went against the law and were taught by other people. And Frederick Douglass became very, very famous for being a person incredibly educated from being a slave. The nature is, there's two issues that go on, and I've seen both. One is that the schools are incredibly subpar. The second, there is in the African American community an idea, sadly, that knowledge is a white thing. One of the jokes one of my clients told me, African American, was that if you ever want to hide something from a black person, put it in a book. And when he first told me the joke, I didn't understand it until he explained it to me, that the idea is that black people don't read because it's not considered to be part of the culture. Now, should it be? Yes, because everybody needs to read. Reading is incredibly fundamental because it teaches you the ability to think and be able to understand ideas even when they're poor ideas. Readers have no doubt heard schools, neighborhoods discussed in these terms and know that the talk is racially coded. Urban and low test scores are code for not white and therefore less desirable. No, I told you about that school in Harlem, predominantly black, and the kids do incredibly well. And that is a desirable school to go to. So much so that they have lotteries where these kids are trying to get in, where you hit the lottery, you get in, and if you don't, then you're stuck to the bad school. While many whites see space inhabited by more than a few people of color as undesirable and even dangerous, considering their perspective, I heard countless people of color describe how painful an experience it has to be when one few of the people of color in their schools and neighborhoods. Although many parents of color want the advantages granted by attending predominantly white schools, they also worry about the stress and even the danger they're putting their children in. These parents understand that the predominantly white teaching force has little, if any, authentic knowledge about children of color and has been socialized to see children of color as inferior and even to fear them. I work in the school system, and in one of the schools I work in, and it happens to be a Jewish school. So this is an interesting one. This is a Jewish school, and in this Jewish school, they have white Jews and black Jews. And guess what? They get along fine. They don't have these types of issues, despite the fact that there are white and black Jews. And the black Jews are not seen as more aggressive or inferior than the white Jews. They see each other as Jewish, not white or black. The black Jews don't walk around saying we're black Jews. They walk around saying we're Jewish. And the white Jews walk around saying they're Jewish. And they don't identify by skin color, they identify by religion. And that's the way that they identify themselves. So the way that when they go out to recess and they're all playing and eating together and they have no issues and they go to each other's houses and all that other stuff because they don't see each other as different. But this person doesn't understand that concept. The most profound message of racial segregation may be that the absence of people of color from our lives is no real loss. Not one person who loved me, guided me, or taught me ever conveyed that segregation deprived me of anything of value. I could live my entire life without a friend or a loved one of color. Does she have a person in her life from every religion, sect, society, and culture? Does she walk around going, okay, this is my friend from Saudi Arabia, this is my friend from Afghanistan, this is my friend from because I wouldn't want to go my entire life without having known somebody from there. This is like ridiculous in terms of the mindset that somehow in order to live my life, I need to have a representation of every person in society. I don't think that's the case. In fact, my life trajectory would almost certainly ensure that I had few, if any, people of color in my life. I might have met a few people of color if I played certain sports in school, or if there happened to be one or two persons of color in my class, but when I was outside of that context, I had no proximity to people of color, much less an authentic relationship. Most whites who recall having a friend of color in childhood rarely keep those friendships in adulthood. Yet if my parents had thought it was valuable to have cross-racial relationships, they would have ensured that I've had them, even if it took effort. The same effort so many white parents expend to send their children across the town so they could attend a better, whiter school. I don't understand the correlation between trying to keep a friend, specifically of a racial background, with the idea of sending a child to school for their education. You're not sending them for the people that are there, you're sending them that they gain something. Pause for a moment and consider the profundity of this message. We are taught that we lose nothing of value through racial segregation. Unless you believe that every race is different from each other inherently, if you see that black people can be good or bad, white people could be good or bad, that this white person is different than this white person, then this friend or that friend, I don't need to have every friend. And I don't need a representation of all different friends. In summary, our socialization engenders a common set of racial patterns. These patterns are the foundation of white fragility. Preferences for racial segregation and a lack of sense of loss of segregation, about segregation. No, there's something called group preference. And it happens to be black people have group preference too. Asians have group preference. Italians have group preference. French have group preference. English have group preference. The nature of group preference and understanding that in social psychology is not taken into account. Lack of understanding about what racism is, or your new definitions of it. Seeing ourselves as individuals except from the forces of racial socialization. We are individuals, yet we're also socialized. Failure to understand that we bring our group history with us, that history matters. Well, to a certain degree, only if you know it. But some people don't know their history and just make it up because they think that it fits their narrative. Assuming everyone is having or can have our experiences. Everyone can have many different experiences. There are many famous, great, accomplished African Americans in our society. How did they do it? Lack of racial humility and unwillingness to listen. Now, I very much believe it's incredibly important to listen and to be able to hear people's points of view. Dismissing what we don't understand. I wonder if you would dismiss me and tell me what I don't understand if I hit you with some facts. Because earlier on, you don't seem to care about facts. You don't. Every time you see that, you say it's white fragility. Anything you argue with, anything's a fact. We don't care about the scientific method. Remember, lack of authentic interest in the perspective of people of color. I definitely do not lack that at all. I'm actually very interested in every single person I meet in their perspective. Wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to the solutions. No, I think that going through the work is fine. Solutions, though, are important. Confusing disagreement with not understanding. No, we can have lots of disagreement. That's fine. Need to maintain white solidarity, to save face, to look good. No problem with that either. Guilt that paralyzes or allow inaction. I happen to agree we don't belong being guilty. Guilt is something that we should take a look at what we've done to try to change. The sense of defensiveness about any suggestion that we're connected to racism. Now again, depending which definition you're using and if it's actually racist or you just trying to create something. Unless you are going to admit that I was right, you're anti-Semitic. A focus on intentions over impact. I think intentions are actually more important than impact in a lot of ways. You kill somebody by accident. You had no intention of killing them. Is very different than you intending to killing them and missing. right? I think that one, make sure you go to jail. The other is, could be an accident. Even though the impact is really bad, somebody could die from an accident. But the intent of trying to kill somebody missing, well, at least I didn't kill you, even though I intended to. I don't think the idea of it, I think intentions do make a difference. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the white supremacist culture in which I am a superior group. Telling me to treat everyone the same is not enough to override this socialization, nor is it humanly possible. I was raised in a society that taught me that there was no loss in the absence of people of color. I wonder how many Jews you went ahead and had to bring in. I wonder how many Afghanis you went ahead and brought into your life, and how much your life was missing the Afghan people. I wonder how many Iraqis that you went out to look for to make sure that you had in your life, because only people of color matter, not any of the other cultures and societies. Then their absence was good and desirable thing to be sought and maintained, while simultaneously denying that fact. This attitude has shaped every aspect of my self-identity, my interests, my investments, what I care about and what I don't care about, what I see and what I don't see, what I'm drawn to and what I'm repelled by, what I take for granted and where I go, and how others respond to me and what I could ignore. Most of us would not choose to be socialized into racism and white supremacy. Unfortunately, we didn't have a choice. While there's variation in how these messages are conveyed and how we internalize them, nothing could have exempted us from these messages completely. Nor is our responsibility to grapple how this socialization manifests itself in our daily lives, and how it shapes our responses when it is challenged. That is the end of Chapter 4. Again, we will start Chapter 5 next time with the good and bad binary. And I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that you liked the video if you liked it. And if you disagree with anything I said, please leave a comment below. If you haven't, please subscribe to the channel and please share it with people who might be interested in the topic. And last but not least, there is a Subscribe-star link below. You can click on that and become a patron to this endeavor if you'd like to. I wish you a good night and good mental health.